10 years ago this week, on August 14th, 2011, Summerslam came to the Staples Center in Los Angeles, a show that Jim Ross was told he would be calling with Michael Cole and Jerry Lawler, until he got to the building and he learned that they were using Booker T instead because they wanted SmackDown represented on the show. So good old JR was relegated to Twitter duty for the night. This was the summer of Punk in WWE. He had won the WWE Championship from John Cena at Money in the Bank. He left with the title when his contract ran out, except he wound up signing a new contract, and they rushed him back to television a week later, after having held a tournament to crown a new champion, which was won by Rey Mysterio, who then lost the belt to John Cena on that same show. Got all that? So Punk returned with his title the same night, rendering the tournament completely pointless, but it allowed them to promote a title unification match in the main event at SummerSlam, which Punk won. And Triple H served as the guest referee. He didn't see John Cena's leg on the bottom rope when he counted the win for Punk, making him the undisputed champion. And then, out from the crowd, making his return to the company for the first time in years, comes Kevin Nash. And he sticks Punk with the jackknife powerbomb. He loves saying that whenever he's asked about this angle. He stuck him with it. He stuck him with the powerbomb, which then allowed Alberto Del Rio to run out and cash in his Money in the Bank contract to win the WWE Championship for the first time. The first time the WWE title had changed hands at SummerSlam in 9 years, since Brock Lesnar's win over The Rock, and only the fourth time in history that the title had changed hands at SummerSlam, which is hard to believe, but it is true. We're talking the WWE title here, not the big gold belt. Only Bret Hart, Mankind, and Brock Lesnar had done it before this. I guess the Summer of Punk didn't really resonate here, though, because this show only did 296,000 pay-per-view buys, the lowest since that Heart and Soul show in 1997 before WWE business took off with the Attitude Era. From 97 to 98, the buy rate for SummerSlam shot up from 235,000 buys to 700,000 buys for the Highway to Hell pay-per-view. That's the power of Stone Cold Steve Austin right there. But Punk never did get his revenge on Nash like he was supposed to, because Nash claims he was taking a blood-thinning heart medication called Plavix, and he could not get cleared, so Punk lost to Triple H instead. The best match on the card, though, was not John Cena against CM Punk. It was Randy Orton regaining the World Heavyweight title from Christian in a no-holds-barred match. That was an excellent match. 5 years ago this week, on August 12th, 2016, Revolution Pro Wrestling hosted its Uprising event from York Hall in London, England, with a most unusual main event of Vader, at 61 years old, and this was only 2 years shy of his death, against Will Ospreay. Now let's take it back to how this all got started. In June of that year, Ricochet and Will Ospreay had a match as part of the Best of the Super Juniors tournament that New Japan has every year. The match went viral. Clips of the match and a lot of the crazy just moves and dives. It looked like something out of a video game. And this thing went viral. It was very polarizing. Some fans loved it. Other fans thought that this is not pro wrestling. Vader was one of those very vocal critics on Twitter. He went on a non-stop tweet storm ripping on Ospreay. Clearly he was trying to get something going. And he ended, one of his tweets that he posted was asking the fans if they would be willing to pay to see him wrestle Ospreay and kick his ass. Now, I believe that the story is that Will Ospreay is the one who went to the promoter at RevPro to request the match. The promoter had reservations about doing it based on Vader's reputation. But he went to Vader, he pitched the idea, and Vader claimed all of his comments were just a work, which I don't believe. I mean, I do believe that he was angling for a match out of it. He played it up. But I absolutely believe that Vader looked at that match with Ospreay and Ricochet and thought that it was not what pro wrestling is supposed to be. 100% I believe that's what he honestly, truly believed. But he was also smart enough to look at this and go, hey, maybe I can actually make some money off this. Both parties agreed to the match. It would be the 61-year-old super heavyweight Hall of Famer. Although he isn't in the WWE Hall of Fame, I don't think, which is pretty ridiculous. But he's a Hall of Famer in my book. The 61-year-old super heavyweight against the 23-year-old junior heavyweight. The biggest styles clash possible. Two generations colliding. And it was a great attraction for RevPro. They sold out the building with over 1,200 fans. Vader could not do much. He had health issues. He was 61. He was as heavy as I ever remember seeing him. I mean, just grossly overweight. So he couldn't do much, but he didn't have to. The heat was off the charts just when he made his entrance. Vader as the heel, Ospreay as the babyface. He attacked Ospreay before the bell and took out the referee. They fought up the ramp, security got involved. They were going for the idea that Vader was shooting. So at least we didn't have to listen to the announcers on pay-per-view talking about Vader going against the script. That's the big difference between this and what I was just talking about with Russo a few minutes ago. But the crowd in the building was into it. Vader chokeslammed Ospreay through the announce table. Ospreay eventually recovered. He did a dive from the ramp onto Vader and the security guys and wiped him out. When it looked like Ospreay might actually win, Pete Dunne interfered. And he took out Will, and then he shook hands with Vader. Dunne was being very friendly with Vader. That brought out Ricochet, who beat Dunne earlier in the night. He took out Pete Dunne, and then with Ospreay's help, they double-teamed Vader, which makes sense, given that it was their match that Vader criticized that got this whole thing started in the first place. They each hit shooting star presses to Vader, who kicked out. He kicked out of 2 shooting star presses. And Ospreay went after Pete Dunne again, but then Vader chokeslammed him. Ospreay kicked out at 1, but then Vader followed that with an even higher chokeslam. I mean, Ospreay was bumping his ass off here. And this time, Vader got the pin, much to the surprise and the dismay and the anger and the rage of the crowd. Lots of "this is bullshit" chants. Vader flipped off the fans. Ospreay in his post-match promo implied, without directly saying so, that Vader refused to lose when he was talking about egos in wrestling. The original plan, this is per the Wrestling Observer at the time, the original plan was that Will Ospreay would win this match. And at first Vader agreed, but he didn't want it to be clean. And then a week before the show, he changed his mind and he said he wanted to win and he wanted to win strong. And then he would be willing to put Will Ospreay over in a rematch. But if you're the promoter, do you honestly believe that Vader is even going to fly back for a rematch? Once he gets his win in that first match that everybody wanted to see, can you trust that this man who already had, a reputation that wasn't exactly great amongst different independent promoters, do you trust that he is going to fly back and do the honors for this kid? So instead, the compromise they came to is they had Pete Dunne and Ricochet interfere with the idea that they would build to an eventual tag team match. It would be Vader and Pete Dunne against Ospreay and Ricochet. Well, there was no tag team match, and the rematch, the singles rematch, never took place. Instead, in October, Vader went on a Twitter tirade claiming that it wasn't he who requested to win the match, but a suggestion from the RevPro people that Ospreay would, do the honors or wanted to do the honors, which is nonsense. It's complete bullshit. I don't believe that for a second. He also claimed that they were liars because part of his deal was that he would receive a copy of the match to sell in the United States. He says that he negotiated for the master tape. And he had the email to prove it, which I don't recall him ever producing said email, which I would love to see. Why would RevPro agree to give him their master tape to sell copies of? What promotion would agree to such a thing? In November, a month later, Vader was in a rollover auto accident that almost killed him. He claimed that he was trapped upside down for over 30 minutes before being rescued. And less than 2 years later, he was dead. And 2 years ago this week, on August 11th, 2019, SummerSlam was in Toronto with a dream match for the ladies. The return of Toronto's own Trish Stratus, the 7-time women's champion, against Charlotte Flair. Trish looked great, having not wrestled full-time in 13 years. She more than held her own. It was kind of a slow start, but it turned into what I thought was a very good match. You know, here's a woman who had the storybook retirement. She won the women's championship in her final match in her hometown of Toronto against Lita, probably her best friend and favorite opponent. They're still friends to this day. It was the storybook final chapter for Trish Stratus. So it was a little bit of a risk coming back here. So many years later, not knowing how she was going to look in the ring and how the fans would treat the match. So here she went down in defeat, but I thought they had a very good match. Bill Goldberg defeated Dolph Ziggler and destroyed him in less than 5 minutes. This was the perfect use of Goldberg and the perfect opponent. Nobody can bump their ass off better for Big Bill than Dolph Ziggler can. He sold those spears like death, like they cut him in half, like a knife through butter. This was also the night that Matt Riddle literally bumped into Goldberg backstage after all of the comments, all the shit talk that Riddle had made, the comments he had made about Goldberg, criticizing how he's not a wrestler, he doesn't know how to wrestle, he mocked his wrestling style. Goldberg even blocked him on Twitter at one point. Riddle was not yet on the main roster, he was with NXT, but he was there for one of those watch-alongs that WWE does on YouTube. And that night, he said he met Goldberg backstage, and he kept saying the word bro. I mean, after everything he says the word bro. So he was saying the word bro a lot, and finally Goldberg says, "I'm not your bro." Now, we did eventually get to see this. This was filmed, because they have cameras everywhere back there. Was it staged? Was it not staged? I'll say this, if it was staged, then Goldberg and all of them did a tremendous job of making it look as authentic as possible, because Goldberg looked like he wanted to rip this guy in half. Riddle actually looked I don't want to say nervous like he was scared, but clearly he was not expecting to bump into Goldberg, and he seemed very nervous. He was kind of like nervously laughing, like, "Okay, bro," you know, like he didn't know kind of what was going to happen or what to say. It's a very awkward situation. But we did eventually get to see the footage, and Goldberg had this very disingenuous smile on his face as he was trying to pretend to be nice to Riddle. You know, if these two had come to blows, I think Riddle would have tied him up in knots if he wanted to. I mean, you got to remember, Riddle comes from an MMA background. He can more than hold his own in a fight. And he's a lot younger than Goldberg, too. I mean, Goldberg is still, he's still a strong guy. He's still a tough-looking guy. But, I mean, if these two came to blows, I think Riddle would tie him up and just embarrass him. Let us not forget, someone who is skilled and trained at such things. We had Chris Jericho years ago in a backstage fight with him and Goldberg. He put Goldberg in a front face lock and supposedly put him down. And Goldberg was trying, but he couldn't do anything because he was locked in a front face lock. So I don't care how big and tough and strong you are, if you have somebody who is trained, whether it's mixed martial arts or jiu-jitsu or amateur wrestling or whatever it may be, and they're young and they're able-bodied, they can embarrass you very quickly. But Riddle said this later. He said, "I think he has the belief, and it worked for him, that all he needs is a couple of moves in wrestling to be one of the best. And he has the spear and the jackhammer. My philosophy is you got to be good at everything. You got to talk, you got to be able to walk, you got to be able to grapple, you got to be able to suplex, you got to be able to do it all. So we disagree on that." Just recently, we saw Goldberg return to Monday Night Raw, right? To challenge Bobby Lashley to a match at SummerSlam for the WWE title. He and Riddle ran into each other again for the first time since that night at SummerSlam. And it sounds like they may have kind of sort of made amends. This is what Riddle said. Bill Goldberg is extremely entertaining. I can't take anything away from that, but I'll tell you this. I saw Bill the other day before he challenged Bobby Lashley, and he was walking to the gorilla position, and I was standing there with Damian Priest at the time, and he says hi to everybody, and then Goldberg comes up to me and gives me a look. He was making a face, and then he goes, "Hey, congratulations, kid." And I was like, oh man, Goldberg is kind of nice. So I gave him a little handshake, and he went out, and he challenged Bobby. And then he was coming back through Gorilla again, and I was like, hey, Goldberg, good stuff. And as he gave me a fist bump, he says, I only need 2 moves. So I was like, oh man, this guy still got it. This show also featured the in-ring debut of the Fiend, Bray Wyatt, against Finn Balor. His entrance alone was the best thing on the entire show. That's how awesome this entrance, the presentation, the entrance, the music, all of it. He came out to a remixed rock version of his old music. He had the Fiend mask on. He had this new lantern, which was a replica of his head, his own face. The eyes were sewn shut. The mouth was stretched out wide open. Freaked me out. Looked a little like Rob Zombie. I don't think I had ever seen someone get a holy shit chant just for their entrance until The Fiend did right here. And Balor got some limited offense, but not much, and Wyatt won with the mandible claw. And after The Fiend disappeared, when the lights came back on, Balor came too. The crowd chanted, "This is awesome." A tremendous debut. And sadly, a more epic fall for The Fiend. This was Balor's final main roster appearance for nearly 2 years, because 2 months after this, he returned to NXT television. And in the main event, Seth Rollins slayed the Beast and beat Brock Lesnar to win the Universal Championship, but he would not have it for very long. He lost it to The Fiend just 2 months later in Saudi Arabia. But before that, we had the horror that was Hell in a Cell 2019 and the main event on that show. The less said about that, the better. And that is this week in wrestling history.